Many of the facts you learned in history class would earn you a big fat F if the history books were written by neutral parties. Here's a few historical lies that might just make you rethink your entire education. Who wouldn't want to fight Nazis? They were evil incarnate, and the world is obviously better off without them. But Americans at the time of World War II were skeptical. President Franklin Roosevelt was the most vocal supporter of joining the war effort, while aviator Charles Lindbergh was dead set against it.
We cannot win this war for England, regardless of how much assistance we send.
Lindbergh's vehement isolationism got him labeled as a Nazi sympathizer. You might have seen on your favorite internet search engine that Lindbergh just admired Germany for their technology and rejuvenated economy under Hitler, but he also thought white people were superior to everyone else, so yeah. Sounds pretty sympathetic. Lindbergh was complicated. He greatly criticized the German government for Kristallnacht and gets singled out today for some pro-Nazi leanings that aren't really there. But here's the thing, it was far more than just Lindbergh.
In February 1939, some 20,000 American Nazis rally in Madison Square Garden.
To lots of Americans, Europe seemed like another world, and it was their fight, not ours. Plus, a war meant another draft, and that was a deal breaker. College students figured they'd be the first to die, so students at Yale formed a large isolationist group called America First that quickly grew to over 800,000 members, including Gerald Ford, Gore Vidal, and John F. Kennedy. But many American Firsters were also anti-Semitic and pro-fascist, as were a large contingent of their leaders. In other words, up until the attack on Pearl Harbor, the conviction to fight for right wasn't nearly as universal as we'd like to believe. One of the worst disasters in American history, the Great Chicago Fire raged for 2 days in October 1871. Newspapers claimed a certain Mrs. O'Leary had been milking one of her cows on October 8th when either she or the animal knocked over a lantern and started the blaze. By the time it died down, 300 people were dead and around 100,000 were homeless. The fire ripped through 2,000 acres, leaving $200 million worth of property in ashes. Naturally, when something this horrible happens, people want a scapegoat, and this time it was Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant who made her living selling milk. Mrs. O'Leary insisted that she'd been asleep the evening the fire started, probably because she got up early to milk her cows in the morning, and mostly because she was asleep when the fire started. Shortly after the fire, an official inquiry stated that there was no way to prove who or what started the fire. Of course, that didn't stop people from blaming O'Leary. When she finally died 24 years later, people said it was of a broken heart. Even today, it's widely and wrongly believed that O'Leary's bovine started the blaze. In fact, several reporters who first accused O'Leary admitted they'd either made up the story or heard it from super unreliable witnesses. And some have recently come to suspect her neighbor Daniel Pegleg Sullivan, the guy who first reported the fire.
Mrs. O'Leary! Mrs. O'Leary! Oh, Mrs. O'Leary! You're born! Look!
Many parts of Sullivan's story don't stand up under scrutiny. But regardless of who or what was at fault, the Chicago City Council finally decided there was no good reason to blame O'Leary. So in 1997, they cleared both Catherine and her infamous long-dead cow. Rosa Parks is best remembered for refusing to give up her seat on the bus, challenging segregation, and sparking the Montgomery bus boycott. Many have assumed that Parks was a tired old woman who spontaneously decided she wasn't moving, but that's not the case. Parks herself clarified, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." When Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat, she was already a respected civil rights leader. Her choice to stay in her seat was a calculated decision and a brave act of protest, not a spontaneous decision. We're not downplaying Rosa Parks or the Montgomery bus boycott, so don't get it twisted. For one thing, Parks was actually in the designated black section of the bus when asked to move. In those days, if the white section filled up, they just sat in the front of the black section. Parks in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP knew this would happen and planted her in the right spot to get things started. This was a calculated move, quite ingenious, that was inspired by a few prior events. One of those events was undoubtedly a spontaneous decision. 15-year-old Claudette Colvin flat out said no way when told to get up.
Hey, you guys have to move because I'm white.
After learning about black history in school, Colvin refused to submit to the racist policy on her local bus and give up her seat for a white passenger.
You know what? I paid my fare the same as this white lady paid her fare, so Claudette's like, have a seat.
In an interview with NPR, Colvin stated, "It felt like Sojourner Truth was on one side pushing me down and Harriet Tubman was on the other side of me pushing me down. I couldn't get up." Why wasn't Colvin made the face of the movement? For one thing, she was young. She was also, and I'm quoting the community leaders here, feisty and uncontrollable. She later became pregnant while still a teen, but that wasn't really a factor. Parks, a calm and determined leader, was a better choice to those in the movement.
The Pilgrims was a bunch of people who wear bell buckles on their head.
Remember elementary school when you dressed up like pilgrims in ill-fitting black and white costumes and big black hats to reenact the first Thanksgiving? Newsflash, the wardrobe wasn't historically accurate, but it's probably best not to tell the moms who sewed their fingers off to get it all done. It's reasonable to assume that pilgrims dressed that way, mindful, demure clothes for mindful, demure people. Except according to historian Caleb Johnson, the pilgrims wore all kinds of styles and colors. The idea that pilgrims dressed like they were colorblind came much later. In the early 1800s, artists like Michel Felice Cornet painted the pilgrims with no real idea what they looked like, so they stuffed them into clothing that was modern and familiar, all that black and white stuff. The minimal women's history you learn in schools usually revolves around the idea that ladies stayed at home, then for a minute they had to go to work in the factories and wear red bandanas during World War II, but they went back home after the war and stayed put until feminism came along. Nope, not even close. Okay, lots of women were housewives or mothers and not allowed or not encouraged to work after getting married. But what about the other women? The ones who didn't have the privilege of not working? What about the decades of history where men and women worked equally?
Notice how anger is your emotional response to any female challenge to your authority.
That's right. Before the Industrial Revolution, work was an extension of the household, and tasks were split evenly between men and women. Even by the turn of the century, women held a quarter of industrial jobs and half of agrarian jobs. Factory work at the time was incredibly dangerous, and gendered labor laws reinforced the growing idea that men should earn the money and women should stay at home.
Do women climb Mount Everest or fly around in Gemini space capsules?
Not yet, but only because conservative males boycott us from our rightful place in the universe.
Even in the 50s, women workers weren't so rare. Look magazine often profiled female workers, and radio programs talked to career girls who felt women should be able to find meaning and purpose outside the home. Important thing is that the working girls got erased, making women seem like frail, put-upon creatures of history till they finally had enough and demanded equal rights. The first women's rights convention in the US was in 1848, and they'd been working long before that. Rosie the Riveter was a marketing ploy more than a movement. In 1903, baseball guide editor Henry Chadwick wrote about how baseball had evolved from the British games of cricket and rounders. The magazine's publisher, sporting goods kingpin Albert Spalding, objected. According to him, baseball was American and simply had to have American origins. Spalding set out to prove it, forming a commission that asked the public for information about the game's early days. The commission's report, issued in 1907, was based mainly on a letter from a man named Abner Graves. He claimed to have been in Cooperstown, New York in 1839 when future Civil War General Abner Doubleday outlined the diamond in the dirt and wrote up rules for a game called baseball.
Welcome, my friends, to the first ever playing of a new sport. A sport of my own devising.
Spalding took this for fact. In doing so, he ignored two actual facts. That commission member A.G. Mills, who was close friends with Doubleday, couldn't remember Doubleday ever mentioning baseball, and that in 1839, Doubleday was a cadet at West Point, not in Cooperstown. All right, fine. I'll say it. That's 2 strikes against Spalding's claims. In the mid-1930s, Major League Baseball made plans to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Doubleday's invention. That's when baseball commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis got a letter from a man named Bruce Cartwright. He claimed his grandfather, Alexander Cartwright, invented baseball and that he could prove it with the original written rules, a field diagram, and a scorecard from the first game, played in Hoboken in 1845. The Hall of Fame honored Cartwright for his contributions, but Doubleday remains the inventor of baseball in the court of public opinion. The 2 most well-known facts about Marie Antoinette are probably that she was guillotined during the French Revolution, and that when warned that her people were starving and running out of bread, she replied,
"Let them eat cake."
While there's no doubt that Marie Antoinette was born into extreme privilege and likely had no comprehension of the struggles her people faced, she almost definitively never said those words. While today almost everyone associates this phrase with Marie Antoinette, it's actually been attributed to many noblewomen throughout history, long before Marie Antoinette was even born. It's likely that the story became associated with the beheaded queen, both because it fit well with her reputation as a vapid, rich woman from a foreign country who was sending France headlong into debt, and because the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau claimed that it had been spoken by a princess, and some mistakenly assumed he was referring to her. Funny thing is, she probably didn't say anything, which isn't any better when you think about it. July 14th, that's Bastille Day, marking the day the French stormed the Bastille to free the unjustly imprisoned and start a revolution, or so you think. After King Louis XVI dragged the nation into poverty, then raised taxes sky high to cover his butt, the people of France were pissed. And on July 14th, 1789, they fought back. But here's the thing. The Bastille was once full of political prisoners, but by 1789, there were just a handful of prisoners left inside. When revolutionaries stormed the place, it wasn't to free prisoners. They showed up to get more gunpowder. The raid turned violent, and the freedom fighters killed, then beheaded the prison guards while, as a side benefit, freeing the remaining inmates. The whole thing was just a case of looting gone wrong. Fortunately for the citizens, the Bastille raid came at the right time, so it turned from a tale about stealing gunpowder and lopping off random heads into a legendary fight against tyranny. They controlled the narrative, so to speak. So when you're celebrating Bastille Day with your 3-foot baguette and most fetching beret, remember, you're really honoring a bunch of beheading-crazed looters with a whopper of a revolutionary excuse. The idea that Gandhi was anything less than pure and perfect used to feel like heresy. But few historical figures have experienced a plot twist quite like Gandhi. In fact, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Joseph Lelyveld's realistic biography of Gandhi has been banned in Gandhi's home state of Gujarat for blasphemy. But that doesn't make Lelyveld's words any less true.
He was viewed alternatively as a fanatic or an eccentric, a reactionary, revolutionary, saint or messiah, or as a man who must be killed.
Most of us don't know Gandhi abandoned his wife to live with a rich male architect before he got involved in British-Indian relations. But Gandhi's sexuality isn't the issue here. The problem is that Gandhi tried to get all references to homosexual traditions erased from Indian temples in an act he called sexual cleansing. And according to Lelyveld, to test his resistance to sexual temptation, he'd sleep in bed naked with his teenage grandnieces. To be fair, the evidence of actual sexual relations Gandhi had with any of the aforementioned is not strong. What is strong is stuff that looks like flat-out racism. Gandhi may have wanted India free of British rule, but he was perfectly happy with the country's rigid caste system. Gandhi wrote of a time when he and his followers were locked up in a lower caste jail for protesting, saying, "We can understand not being classed with whites, but to be placed on the same level as the natives seemed too much to put up with. They're troublesome, very dirty, and live like animals." When asked about Indian views on race versus those of white South Africans, he wrote, "We believe as much in the purity of races as we think they do." Gandhi referred to the black South Africans by a slur that I'm not going to say or define, but let's just say he didn't respect them. There's no denying the good Gandhi did for the world, but he was only human, and today he's more recalled for his negative aspects than what school books said 30 years ago about him. Without John F. Kennedy, we may never have had civil rights legislation, or so we've been taught. But when Kennedy heard about the planned March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, he actually tried to stop it. He even sent Vice President Johnson to Norway during the march because he didn't like LBJ's pro-civil rights policies.
Each time a big issue came up, the president and the attorney general did everything they could not to have to get involved.
Kennedy was forced to act on civil rights after the Freedom Riders and the assassination of Medgar Evers, but he thought the legislation would fail and hurt his chances of passing the bills he really cared about. After Kennedy was assassinated, though, new President Johnson put all his effort behind the Civil Rights Act. LBJ used the people's grief over the loss of the beloved young president to get Congress to act, and in the end, JFK got all the credit. World War II is often considered the last war where the lines between good guys and bad guys were clear. The Axis powers wanted to take over the world. The Allies wanted to stop them. But nothing is ever that simple. American GIs were responsible for numerous war crimes as horrific as those committed by the Japanese and Germans. For example, in 1943, US soldiers invaded the island of Sicily, and inspired by an intentionally ambiguous speech from General George S. Patton, murdered at least 77 POWs in what is known as the Biscari Massacre. It was even worse for European women. GIs were responsible for approximately 14,000 sexual assaults in England, Germany, and France from 1942 to 1945. But things took a truly barbaric turn in the Pacific Theater. Even though it was illegal, American troops made a habit of taking trophies from dead Japanese soldiers, and not by fumbling through their pockets or taking their weapons. GIs actually lopped off ears, pulled out teeth, and took bones as mementos to send to their parents, wives, and girlfriends. This behavior went all the way to the White House. In 1944, a congressman gave President Roosevelt a letter opener made from a Japanese arm, and the president responded with, "This is the sort of gift I like to get." Everybody knows the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The surprise attack left over 2,000 Americans dead and finally forced the US into World War II. But despite what many people think, it wasn't the last time the Japanese dropped bombs on US soil. In February 1942, a Japanese sub fired a couple of shells at an oil field near Santa Barbara. Then in June, another sub lobbed explosives at a fort on the Columbia River. That same year, a pilot named Nobuo Fujita dropped 4 incendiary bombs into the forests of southern Oregon, hoping to spark massive fires. Thankfully, the woods were just too wet, but the Japanese had more success with their fugos, fire balloons that floated across the Pacific Ocean and landed on US soil. While only one of around 6,000 balloons actually killed anyone, that fugo claimed the lives of a pregnant woman and 5 children in Oregon.
The nation was kept in the dark. No one wanted the Japanese to find out their devices worked.
Crazier still, the Japanese straight up invaded the Aleutian Islands and set up bases in the Alaskan Territory, prompting an island hopping campaign that stretched from June 1942 to August 1943. Of course, the Japanese weren't the only ones trying to bring down the US. The Nazis were involved too, only instead of dropping bombs, they were dropping saboteurs. In 1942, U-boats deposited 8 saboteurs in both Florida and New York. These agents planned on destroying as many railroads, bridges, hydroelectric plants, and factories as possible. They even wanted to shut down New York City's water supply. Fortunately, 2 of the spies got cold feet and sold their buddies out to the FBI before any damage was done.
The submarine saboteurs were in jail 2 weeks after they landed. 6 of the 8 were executed after a military trial.
By 1860, there were 4.4 million black people in the United States, and 3.9 million of them were enslaved. But there were a surprising number of slave owners who actually weren't white. Wanting to fit in with white society, wealthy members of the Cherokee Nation owned around 4,600 black slaves. The tribe even sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War because they didn't want to lose their slaves. Stranger still, in 1830, about 3,700 black freedmen owned slaves. In fairness, a few of them bought their own family members to protect them, but that wasn't always the case. Take William Ellison. One of the wealthiest men in South Carolina, Ellison was a black man who used his 63 slaves to work his 900 acres. And he wasn't at all concerned with keeping friends and family members safe. The guy just wanted free labor. And before Ellison was even born, there was Anthony Johnson, a black man who won a court decision in 1654 to keep a black indentured servant as a slave. As historian R. Halliburton Jr. points out, this was one of the first known legal sanctions of slavery and helped set the terrible precedent that would only end with the deadliest war in U.S. history. If slavery in America lasted around 250 years, why weren't there more slave revolts? Sure, there was Nat Turner's Rebellion and the Amistad Mutiny, but other than those 2 super famous incidents, why didn't more slaves fight back against their captors? They absolutely did. Some historians estimate that there were over 300 revolts and conspiracies, and while most of these were put down violently, a few were surprisingly successful. There was the Stono Rebellion of 1739, where around 100 slaves overthrew their white masters and fled for Spanish Florida, where slavery was illegal. These heroes were cut down by the English, but the group made history with the biggest slave rebellion in the 13 colonies. Then there was the German Coast Uprising of 1811, in which slaves attacked a militia warehouse, armed themselves to the teeth, and tried to capture New Orleans. They were defeated after 2 days, and around 100 black prisoners had their heads cut off and placed on poles along the side of the road. There was also the time 300 slaves teamed up with 20 Native Americans to seize a Florida fort, and there was an 1800 incident in which Gabriel Prosser assembled an army of 1,000 slaves but was undermined by a traitor and bad weather. In 1842, slaves turned on their Cherokee and Creek masters and made a brave but futile run for the Mexican border. On a happier note, in 1841, slaves aboard the ship Creole staged a mutiny and sailed to freedom in the Bahamas. And if you want to look outside the US, in 1791, Toussaint Louverture led a massive slave rebellion in Haiti, which led to the country's independence.
They fought the French, the British, and the Spanish army for 12 years.
Haiti was actually the second North American territory to gain independence, only behind the good old US of A. One of the most common myths about the colonial era is that Indigenous Americans were baffled by European colonists because they had no concept of land ownership. Since they didn't understand owning property, they didn't realize the settlers were taking something away from them. Not true. In reality, many communities living in North America had extensive legal systems of their own before the arrival of Europeans. These included rules about owning land. As described in the American Historical Review, this belief that the people who lived in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans had no concept of owning land comes from philosopher John Locke, who believed that indigenous peoples were wild men who roamed the forest hunting and gathering and never worked the land. He believed that only white people cultivated crops. Turns out that the vast majority of people who lived in the Americas farmed, as in planting seeds and growing stuff. Even hunter-gatherer communities had designated land that they lived on, worked on, and maintained for future generations. Though school taught us differently, Southerners didn't get a patent on racism, and people of the North have their own terrible history of slavery. The colonial North thrived on the slave trade in the 1700s. During the Revolution, George Washington told Northern and Southern colonists that we must fight the British so we don't become as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. By 1804, slavery was abolished in the North, but it didn't happen all at once. Some states left in provisions to slowly free slaves over time, and by 1840, Connecticut still had 17 slaves listed on the census. In 1740, a fifth of New York City's population were enslaved people, and New York had the second highest rate of slave ownership in the country, behind only Charleston, South Carolina. Slave labor built much of the city, and although they didn't have to work on plantations, you were still considered property to be bought, sold, and used isn't much consolation. Even during the Civil War, New York City came close to joining the secession after South Carolina. The city wanted to side with the South mostly for economic reasons, and they had no moral problem with the idea of siding with slaveholders. The New York Herald wrote, "If Lincoln is elected, you will have to compete with the labor of 4 million emancipated Negroes." So if a Yankee gets a little high and mighty around his Southern friends, just remind him of that quote and all the terrible history behind it, and watch the guilt make him spontaneously combust. Many believe that the Plymouth Colony Pilgrims gathered their savior Squanto and his tribe together for a massive feast to thank them for their help in growing crops. This story, while heartwarming, is total myth.
Hello, Englishman. I am Squanto. Perhaps we should strike a treaty between our peoples. Good idea.
The man we know as Squanto was actually a Wampanoag man named Tisquantum. He was able to help the Pilgrims not only avoid starvation, but also to communicate with the people who already lived there because he already spoke English himself. He learned the language after being kidnapped and trafficked as a slave by the British years before. Incredibly, he was able to escape and after working for a British merchant for many years, negotiated his way back home. Tragically, the arrival of Europeans in his homeland caused a massive epidemic that took the lives of tens of thousands. Without a family to return to, Tisquantum, Squanto, chose to help the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims really did have a harvest celebration, but they didn't invite the local people as a sign of gratitude for Squanto's help.
You have taken the land which is rightfully ours.
Celebratory gunfire from the Pilgrims was interpreted by the surviving Wampanoag as an act of war. After the conflict was resolved, it's possible that they provided some food to the Plymouth colony, but as a specific friendly singular gathering, the Thanksgiving celebrated today probably never happened.
Welcome to our banquet. Cheese, Mr. Sowett. Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving. That's what we're calling it.
It's more likely that it memorializes several feasts of the Pilgrims, including one that celebrated the Mystic Massacre, in which colonists murdered several hundred Pequots in Connecticut as part of an ongoing conflict. But that Pequot War, it's complicated. I'll save that for another video one day.